Originally, I was gonna do something crazy like grilling a burger on my Porsche exhaust tips, which I actually tried to do, and that didn't turn out too well.
It's called congratulations, you played yourself.
So second, I thought, hey, maybe I'll do this video showing my favorite martini recipe. But now that I'm here, I'm kind of thinking I don't want to share that. That's just too valuable. Seeing as how I got started on this whole photography thing, wanting to shoot cars, I thought I'd take it back to my roots and do a little tutorial on shooting cars in broad daylight, which, as any other photographer will tell you, shooting anything in broad daylight is extremely challenging. As a beginning car photographer, that's just one of the things that you deal with from time to time, and there's just no way around it. So I figured, why not make a video on that? So first of all, thank you to all 100+ of you that have subscribed to this channel so far. Wouldn't be here without you guys, so cheers. And for those of you that are interested in getting started in automotive photography, or for those of you that are having trouble shooting cars in broad daylight, this one's for you. But first, hot damn, almost forgot the most important part. Voila! So anyways, let's get started with the video. So the first question for a lot of beginner photographer and videographers is, why is shooting in direct sunlight so difficult? And that's because basically there's a big difference between the brightest highlights of your picture or video and the darkest shadows, which to the human eye looks nothing out of the normal, but cameras, even the most expensive cinema cameras, still don't have as much dynamic range as the human eye. And if you couple that with direct sunlight, the shadows are going to have very sharp, defined shapes, and especially for human faces and cars and things like that, it just is not a flattering look. So that's why if you ask any photographer, shooting in bright, harsh, direct sunlight is one of the worst shooting conditions you could have. Especially when you consider that cars, depending on the type of paint they have, which is pretty much any paint except for matte, I guess, basically acts as a giant reflective mirror in the sun. So also is a different challenge there. Basically what this whole video is going to come down to is that you shouldn't try to force your camera to see things the way your human eyes see them, because you're never going to get the results you want and you're always going to be disappointed. And especially when you're beginning and you're going to car meets, which, you know, popular time for car meets is around noon, it's pretty challenging for photographers. So you do end up dealing with it quite a bit. Now this is not all to scare you away from trying it, because I still believe that as a developing photographer or videographer, shooting in the most challenging conditions helps you grow the fastest. So this is to help you hopefully not shy away from that too much. Also, I originally tried shooting this video on site on my GoPro, which was just not a good idea. That is just not a flattering angle for your face, and the audio with the wind, and take the same angle but come in, and the airplanes, clouds cover up the sun in a little bit, and things like that. It was just not a good time, so I'm actually having to re-record all this dialogue. But anyways, I digress. Let's jump into the tips. So tip number 1, set your camera to shoot in RAW and expose properly for the highlights in your image. If you caught one of my previous videos, we took my little sister's 12-year-old Canon DSLR, and even that 12-year-old ancient entry-level DSLR was able to shoot RAW pictures and get decent results with its tiny 12-megapixel sensor. So any type of digital DSLR you can get now will most likely work out for you here. And shooting in a RAW format will help you kind of even out the curve between those really bright highlights and really dark shadows, and it'll give you a lot of flexibility you're going to need later in post. So that's a really important setting for your camera. You should also be shooting with your lowest native ISO. I think that should go without saying, considering you're shooting in the brightest sunlight available. If you're shooting in automatic, depending on what camera you're using, it might not know to do that. So make sure you're shooting in manual, step down your ISO to its lowest native to get the best dynamic range and the lowest noise. Typically when you're shooting and you're exposing for your highlights, the brightest thing in your picture is normally the sky, but typically when you're shooting cars, I actually find that the car is the brightest part of the image. So when you're editing later in post, you're gonna bring up all the shadows and darker parts of your image. And actually when you first initially take the picture, it will look very dark, which is totally okay because we've seen even with these old, ancient, entry-level DSLRs, when you're shooting in RAW, you can still recover most of the detail you need later in post. So don't be afraid that your photos look really dark when you first take them. I also find that if your sky looks darker than the car, you should probably bring the brightness up of your sky separately to help your whole picture look not so artificial. Again, depending on your shooting conditions, this might not always go, but typically what I find in my own pictures is that if I'm taking a picture outside and the sky with the white clouds and in the middle of the day is not the brightest part of the image, it looks a little unnatural, at least to my eye. And also because there's such a huge difference in lighting contrast with the interiors and exteriors of cars, at least with, you know, non-convertible cars, you should probably not try to shoot the interior and the exterior of the car in the same shot. You know, go one or the other, but don't try to do both in the same shot. None of these things are hard rules, so I'm not going to say to not try anything, but I've never been able to get a picture in broad daylight of a car's interior and exterior at the same time, at least with my camera, and have it look nice. So there's too much dynamic range to try to capture in one image, so I usually just try to do them separately. And then next tip is don't shoot with your lens wide open. The lens I'm using in this camera opens all the way up to f2.8. Actually, for this shoot, I shot most of my pictures at f5.6 or above. And that's not just because it's super bright outside, but you have to be aware of what you're capturing with your depth of field on your given lens. So just because your lens can go all the way down to f1.4 doesn't mean you should, especially for cars. You know, cars are obviously a lot bigger than people, so you know, that really shallow depth of field might be good for shooting a portrait, but when you're shooting a car, which is a lot longer, you're only going to get a sliver of that car in focus when you're shooting with a super shallow depth of field. And also, there's a ton of detail that you want to capture in the look of a car that you don't always want to capture in things like skin. So stepping your lens down will help you get sharp details on every bit of your car. So step your lens down a little bit, get sharper details, get a wider depth of field, get more things in focus. I'm getting a little hungry. And so on top of that, if you're shooting your car in a really interesting background, you're gonna have to step your aperture up even further to capture and focus background as well. Maybe even above f8, f11, something crazy like that for a really sharp image. Again, because you are shooting in broad daylight, that shouldn't be an issue. And again, this isn't a hard rule because typically you will want to get super punched in tight detail shots where you only want one little thing in focus in your image. And that's when you should shoot with a wider aperture. That's when I found myself shooting at f2.8, is when I just wanted to capture one little tiny thing on the car in focus, where I really punch in and separate it from everything else on the car. So there are going to be times when you want to shoot with a wider aperture, but for the most part, especially when you are shooting the full car, you want your aperture to be a little higher for things like that. Anytime you're shooting a picture of a car, just ask yourself, what do I want in focus and what do I want out of focus, and what aperture do I need to achieve that? And again, you can take the same exact shot at multiple different apertures and then decide in post later what you like the best. Typically I'd sit there, start at f2.8, take the picture, go to 5.6, adjust my shutter speed for the red exposure, take the picture again, go to f8, adjust my exposure, so on, so on. So the next tip has to do with CPL filters. So a CPL filter is a circular polarizing filter, and what they do, particularly when shooting cars, is they help you minimize reflections on the paint. So by rotating this polarizing filter, you're eliminating reflections depending on what angle it's catching the light at. So I've seen a lot of photography channels on YouTube saying that you should always shoot with a CPL filter anytime you're shooting with cars, which if you think about it makes sense, but actually in my experience I'm gonna say no, not always. So the idea is that because cars are giant mirrors and reflect everything, especially in broad daylight, using a CPL will help you eliminate all that unwanted noise and detail in the reflection. But you know, sometimes I do kind of end up liking the look of the reflections in the car, so you just have to be aware of what you're trying to do. And I definitely wouldn't shoot with the CPL on 100% of the time. At least take a look at what your picture looks like without a CPL filter first, and then make the call if you want to see the reflections or not. Because a lot of the times, even during this shoot, sometimes seeing the reflection in the paint added to the overall picture and added an extra cool element or layer of depth to it that you otherwise would have completely missed if you were just shooting with your CPL filter and eliminating all of that. So it can actually introduce some pretty cool things to your picture by leaving your CPL filter off. And also, when you have a car that's beautifully taken care of with the paint being perfectly polished and waxed and really shiny and taken care of, you know, shooting with your CPL filter off and capturing all of the shine and glory of the paint just soaking up the sun, that can tell a whole different story about the car on its own. And again, you would probably miss that if you were using a CPL filter. So be mindful of what your picture looks like with and without. You know, you might find that you won't use a CPL filter 100% of the time. If you're shooting at an exotic location or something where there's like waterfalls or nice trees or, you know, fall leaves or cherry blossoms or cool things that are bouncing off the car, I would definitely try to leave those things in. I think that would look like a pretty awesome picture. If you're trying to do detail shots, that is a good time to use a CPL. But it's not just good to write off. A CPL filter is always a necessity when shooting cars. And so tip number 4, and this has a whole bunch of parts built into it, is to experiment with your focal length, the height you're taking your picture at, and the angles you're shooting the car at. You want to get a variety of focal lengths, compositions, and heights that you're shooting at. The number 1 configuration I would try to avoid is shooting at a focal length and height that's similar to the human eye. So typically that would be shooting with, let's say, a 16 to 35 millimeter, and then you just stand there, put your camera up, and you shoot at eye level with a 16 to 35. That's probably one of the worst configurations you could have, just because it looks so similar to what you're already seeing with your human eye. It's not going to look interesting and it's not going to stand out. There's going to be nothing special told about it. A really flattering look for the car is when you zoom in really tight. I'll zoom my lens between 50 to 75 millimeter, stand physically farther back, and take a shot of the car that way. And it's a lot more flattering. The proportions of the car look nicer. The background is more compressed. And it really helps put emphasis on the car and make it look a lot cooler. And then also taking your picture lower to the ground makes the car look faster, cooler, meaner, and it puts more emphasis on the car as a whole. And typically you don't see cars from that angle. It's like when you see a car driving on the road, you don't lay down and look at it from the floor. So try to take your pictures from angles that you wouldn't normally see the car from. And then when you're shooting in really uninteresting locations like parking lots, which is where most car meets take place, getting detail shots and really close, zoomed in, punched in compositions is going to be really cool for eliminating the ugly background or bystanders or things like that. And just focus on minute details of the car that you find really interesting. And ideally you'd want to find details that most people wouldn't normally pay attention to and wouldn't notice otherwise. And obviously by using a more zoomed in focal length, you're either reducing the amount of background you see or just eliminating it altogether, depending on how far from the car you stand. And close in detail shots will also help you combat the issues with crazy dynamic range. Because the sun is not falling evenly across the whole car, if you're shooting really close and punched in, you don't have to worry about that if you're only capturing one part of the car at a time. when you're shooting wide shots of the car with half the car in super direct, harsh sunlight, and the other half of the car is in crazy dark shadow, shooting a wide shot might not be the best way to go. So that way you're eliminating what could give your camera a hard time. And you know, I wouldn't count on this every time, but you know, occasionally a cloud might come in front of the sun and soften the light up momentarily enough for you to take a wider shot of the car. But again, you can't predict the weather, so don't always count on that. Just make sure to take advantage of it if it were to happen. And so shooting with really wide focal lengths will distort the proportions of the car, especially if you're shooting it up close, which, you know, isn't typically undesirable, but they do make for some really interesting, unique, stylized, and sometimes even epic looking shots. You know, it won't be a realistic representation and it won't look always flattering, but it can make for some very interesting, epic shots. So definitely experiment with it. So obviously don't be afraid to shoot on the wider end also. And I typically find myself shooting cars physically lower to the ground, but you know, once in a while when you have a car that's in a cool environment and you want to take in as much of the surrounding area as you can, you know, an up high wide shot might actually turn out really, really cool. And I have taken a couple like that. So, you know, don't be afraid to break rules or break these conventions. And then again, if you find a really nice angle to the car that you like, take it at multiple focal lengths if you have multiple lenses or a zoom lens. You know, I might start far away from the car at an angle I like and take it at 75, take a couple steps in, and then take the same shot at 50 millimeters and reframe, and then take the same shot at 35 millimeters a little bit closer up, and that way you have the same angle at multiple focal lengths and you could decide later what you like the best. And so tip number 5 is to experiment with your position relative to the sun. Walk all the way around the car, look for angles that you find interesting with the given light. And you know, again, throughout a shoot, things are probably going to change the longer you stay there, so a new angle might reveal itself later in the day. And so typically what I try to do when the sun's really harsh is shoot the side of the car that's facing the sun at a bit of an offset, so anywhere from 30 to 90 degree angle from my back to the sun, and that will usually be pretty flattering because that way you don't have to deal with the shadowed side of the car, and it's not so direct where you get a direct reflection from the sun that just shows all the ugly bits of paint. By trying not to shoot the side of the car that's in the shade and the side of the car that's facing the sun at the same time, you're saving your camera and you a lot of stress. And so probably the worst angle that I almost always find when shooting a car in broad daylight is shooting into the sun. So the car right in front of you with the sun directly in the background, absolutely the worst angle I find 99.9% of the time. It's because you're literally forcing your camera to see the brightest possible part in the sky and also the darkest possible part of the car in the same frame. I don't think any camera could do well in that situation. If you expose properly for your highlights so they're not blown out, and you try to bring up your shadows in post, you'll either not get that detail back or it'll be so noisy and ugly it's going to be unusable. Again, conversely, shooting with your sun directly behind you at the car will provide just such a harsh light that it will make apparent any tiny little scratch or swirl mark or imperfection in the paint and just amplify it times 20. It's extremely unflattering, like especially with my car and its black paint. Shooting with the sun directly at my back just shows all the swirl marks and scratches of being, 13-year-old paint, and it's just not a usable image. And again, you might be able to get away with that on like some cars depending on the condition or color of the paint. I think for most cars it'll typically be not great. But again, none of these are hard rules, so try everything, keep walking around the car at different times of the day, and new angles will reveal themselves. Try anything, don't be afraid to experiment. Because a good photographer will still be able to learn a lot from their worst pictures. They'll know 50 ways not to take a picture of a car next time. And so that pretty much wraps it up for the big tips. I'll throw a couple little ones at you that I kind of encountered while shooting today. So tires are ugly. You really want to not take a picture of your car where it's showing the tread of the tires. Because first of all, if you're seeing the tread of the tire, you're probably not seeing much of the actual rims, the wheels, and there's nothing special about it. All cars have rubber, all cars have tread, at least road legal ones anyways, and it's just not an interesting thing to see in a picture. Either reposition yourself and get an angle where you don't see it, or if you have more control, then ask the owner to rotate the wheel so it's not showing tread. And another thing I tried today, and this kind of goes for any type of photography, not specifically just automotive, but experiment with foreground elements. So even if you're shooting in an ugly location like I was today, throwing bits of things in the foreground can add another interesting layer of depth to your picture and maybe make it a little more interesting. And it never hurts to try, even if it ends up not looking the way you intended or not looking interesting at all. It's always good to try it, just so it's not just a picture of a car in a parking lot. It could tell a different type of story. If you're peeking through tall grass or bushes, it might give your car like a in the wild type feel, or it's being spied on. Foreground elements are always interesting, so experiment with those also. Not for every picture, but occasionally when you want a little more context, foreground elements will definitely help your picture do that. And last but not least, don't be a dick. Again, I feel like this should go without saying, but most people just don't get it. Is don't park your car where you shouldn't be parking it. Don't block fire lanes, don't block driveways, don't park on crowded streets and slow traffic down. Definitely don't block any type of traffic. And again, I feel like this should be a no-brainer, but I've seen idiots stop traffic to take a stupid picture of their car way too many times. It boils my blood, so don't be an idiot. And so that's it. It's a pretty basic intro to car photography tips that really helped me a lot, and I wish I knew sooner when I started out. And hopefully they help you as a beginner or as someone who's just looking to up their game a little bit. So, as always, hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks again to my first 100 subscribers. Cheers to you guys. And again, I've only been shooting for 2 or 3 years now, and I'm still extremely new to this, so I'm sure I missed lots of helpful hints that I don't even know yet. So feel free to leave a comment down below. Correct me if I made a mistake, or if you disagree, or if you just have something to add. It's always helpful, because I still have a lot to learn. I kind of just wanted to put this out there because I've watched tons and tons of great videos on automotive photography in the past year or so, but a lot of these things I've never heard mentioned before on even some of the best channels. So I just wanted to put in my own 2 cents, say a couple things that I found a little bit different, I didn't hear talked about before, and hopefully they help you guys out. Also make sure to post some links down below of really helpful automotive focused channels that help me develop a lot. Hopefully you guys found that helpful, and maybe at 1 million subscribers, I'll show you guys my martini recipe. But until then,